Today, I'm joined by my friend, Dr. Rob Henderson. Rob grew up in the foster care system of California, is an Air Force veteran, went to Yale on the GI Bill, and received his PhD in psychology from the University of Cambridge. He's the author of Troubled, a memoir of foster care, family, and social class, which we'll be talking about today. Rob, welcome back to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Hey, Adam. Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here.
I've known you personally for over a year, and I've been following your newsletter for over 3 years and have read most of what you've published online. So coming into this book, into Troubled, I was thinking, yeah, I pretty much know the story. This is great to support you and fill in some of the gaps, but there was actually a lot in there that I didn't know about you. And I imagine that's the same for most of your readers, maybe even people in your personal life.
I think that's right. That's one of the benefits of writing a book. You can tell the whole story in a way that you can't in an 800-word essay or even in a full chapter. It's just the ability to, you know, go on at length and get into some of the details. And that was, I guess, the struggle that I had was, because I don't want to be long-winded. I didn't want to be
Mhm.
boring, but I did want to tell the full comprehensive story and, give the reader more than just a glimpse of my upbringing and experiences, more than what they would have gotten in some of my essays and posts and op-eds and other writing.
Were you being strategic about certain things? Because I know you mentioned you started this book project at around the beginning of your PhD, even before you blew up on Substack. Did you ever have things in mind of like, I'm never going to write an article about this. This is reserved for the book?
Yeah, actually, yeah, that was something else that I was reflecting on a lot, especially like once my newsletter started picking up, and I remember I was approached by different outlets that I've written for. I wrote this piece in the Free Press back when it was still called Common Sense in late 2021, and they wanted me like in 2021 there was this big piece that came out of the Wall Street Journal about the increasing gender disparity in higher education, how boys are dropping out, and like now college campuses are 60% women, and it's just like projected to increase. That I think within like the next 10 years, 2 out of 3 students are going to be women on college campuses. And they asked me to write something about this. And, I remember kind of, there was some conflict because they wanted me to like really sort of tell some of the details and some of the, uh, very personal firsthand experiences. And I wanted to like, I told them I would write that for them. Eventually they could excerpt it. And they actually did. Like this piece ran just a few days
Mhm.
ago, that was excerpted from my book. But at that point, 2.5 years ago or 3 years ago, I was just very much like, you know, there are certain things that I want to reserve until the book is available, and then people can get the full story. And so that was hard because when I was writing my newsletter, there were, sometimes I would write personal stuff. I mean, most of it is like commentary and, summaries of research and that kind of stuff. But, I'd tell the occasional personal story. And, yeah, I would think like, I don't want to just give all this stuff away right now. And it also sort of kept the creative energy and juices flowing when I was writing the book, that I didn't feel like I'd already sort of given
Mhm.
everything in the essays. And I hoped that I guess, yeah, that was kind of the intended effect for someone like you reading the book. And, you may have some sort of idea of the outlines and the contours of the story, but then, um, because I'd never written about it before, that there were some surprises and some intrigue and some, it held people's attention in a way that it wouldn't have if I'd already just sort of posted all of it on Substack.
There were two parts you mentioned from your childhood that surprised me, but also made complete sense once I read it. Because I think I imagined beforehand learning about your story, you describe yourself as not a great student and not motivated in school. So I just assumed that meant the intellectual interest didn't come whatsoever until later, until discipline came from the military and maybe intellectual interests opened up once you had all that free time and once you came to Yale. But you mentioned this love of reading that you've had from an early childhood.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, that's I mean, I tell the story of how I learned to read and how when I was in the foster homes, no one read to me, and I was changing schools all the time, and I just wasn't in a position to be sort of focused at school. Um, but eventually I did teach myself how to read, um, when I was 7, which is pretty late to read. I mean, I like, now worked with kids, I've mentored kids, and, like, kids, are supposed to start kind of gradually learning how to read and their alphabet and all that stuff at, like, 4, 5, like, so I was 7, and I was like, once I taught myself to read, I was sort of picking up kindergarten books, and teachers would let me borrow books. I check out books from the library, and I was, like, reading books that were 2 and 3 grades below my level, trying to sort of catch up. And then once I did figure it out and, things clicked for me and I was able to comprehend and, understand what I was reading, it just became a kind of source of comfort for me when I was a kid. Um, feeling isolated, feeling alone, and feeling like the world was this, big sort of chaotic uh space. And then, then I'd go to a book and it was like, I temporarily forget about my circumstances and sort of get lost in a different story. And so, that the habit kind of waxed and waned throughout my childhood and in my youth. There were probably periods and months and so on that I didn't read at all. And then others where I would read more, but, it was kind of a mainstay all throughout. And yeah, it was a habit that's been with me, yeah, ever since I was 7, teaching myself to read.
You also wrote about this limbo period teaching yourself to read, where you could read and you could read the words aloud, but you didn't fully connect in your child mind. Like, this is literally a story with information that I'm getting. I'm not just performing this mindless task. And it reminds me of when I was in elementary school, we had this like reading levels thing. And what you do, you'd read a book, and then at the end, you'd take a test on the computer. And it was like a 10, 20 question multiple choice on it. And then if you passed, you had to pass like a few of those at each reading level, and then you'd advance a reading level. And within my school, within my class, there was a little bit of a competition there. And some of the books, like the longer it was, the more points you got. So if you read like the 600-page Harry Potter, that counted as like 2 or 3 books. So there was this competition. And I remember in 4th or 5th grade, I was getting to at least point wise a 7th or 8th grade reading level. And then I started picking up like the 8th grade level books, and I would read them, finish them, but then start failing the quizzes. So it was something kind of similar. It's like I could follow along when it was a story like Harry Potter, but then it reached a point where the most advanced things they had, it was either more nonfiction or just something more complex like Animal Farm that a child isn't gonna really follow. And then so I was like reading, but I wasn't fully digesting, kind of in a similar way that you mentioned the beginning of your reading life.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah, I mean, there is that sort of mismatch, like, you can sound out the words, you can read it, like, just sort of that rote, saying aloud what you're s what's on the page. But then as far as, like, tracking the plot and the characters and comprehending the text and yeah, it's like, it's really interesting because when you're a little kid, you don't really, understand subtext and like Animal Farm, right? Like, ostensibly, it's just a story of animals on a farm, but then, of course, it's an allegory for the Soviet Union and blah, blah, and, like, I mean, it's a great story, and, now yeah, now I'm, now as an adult, you sort of learn to, like, look for subtext or, like, as someone who, if you consume more sort of sophisticated stories and fiction, but, yeah, at that time, it took a while, right? Like, it was actually pretty easy for me to, like, learn how to sound out words and, once I sort of practiced the alphabet and got those things down. But then, like, once I recognized, like, "Oh, there's something else, there's another piece to reading that I wasn't fully getting until, I really, had some experiences reading aloud and talking to other kids." And then, yeah, it's an interesting point that, yeah, there are different components to reading that I had to sort of piece together myself.
In children's stories, TV shows, movies, you often see sometimes these clever one-liners that are clearly meant for the adults who are watching. But even
Mhm.
aside from those, I've found that I've started to appreciate children's stories a lot more. Like, they just seem richer. And I wonder if there's this sort of curve where like everyone likes them as a child, as an adolescent, you think this is too kiddie, I'm too cool for this. And then as an adult, you begin to reappreciate it. Like my girlfriend and I will watch Disney movies, the classics, and it's great. And I can't imagine how, as a teenager, like I was thinking, I don't like Disney anymore, like thinking it made me cool to dismiss it.
Yeah, I wonder if there's, there's sort of a signaling, counter signaling thing there where, yeah, like there is that kind of like low, medium, high that the people in the middle don't want to look like the people in the bottom, but people at the top don't
Hmm.
care because they're already at the top. And so they don't mind being confused for someone at the bottom. And so you can maybe sort of see something like that with like intellect, right? Or, like I remember as a little kid, when you're like 4 or 5 years old watching Barney. I don't know if Barney existed when you were a little kid, the purple
Hmm.
dinosaur, but that was like, the coolest thing ever at age 4. And then like around, I wanna say like 7, it was like, "Oh, you probably watched Barney," and then like kids made fun of each other. And then like now as an adult, it's like, no one's gonna make fun of you for watching Barbie or Barney and thinking it's interesting. Um, because people will know, like, you're watching it for other reasons, you're kind of whatever, you're watching it from, like, an anthropological or stance or, like, just from that sort of perspective of curiosity or nostalgia or whatever, and, yeah, and I think that, yeah, I remember, like, this happened with Power Rangers, like, all the little kid shows and movies and fiction and everything, probably Disney too. Yeah, if you're, like, 15 years old and you're obsessed with, I don't know, Lion King or something, like,
Uh-huh.
yeah, your friends would make fun of you. But then I think like 25 and 30, like after that, it's like, no one's gonna mock you for it.
I think you see a similar thing during adolescence. Like as a teenager, I was watching things like Family Guy and South Park and thinking these are so adult like and cool because they're cursing a little bit and referencing sex and drugs and stuff like that. And now I look back and, there's nothing wrong with them. I still like it from time to time, but I think these are pretty adolescent shows. And what the adults are really watching are the things you psychoanalyze, like Mad Men and Breaking Bad and stuff like that.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I kind of feel the same way actually. 'Cause I love those shows as a teenager, right? Because you wanna like really, I mean, it's not conscious, like the signaling aspect, you're not consciously, but you just really want to like prove to yourself and to others that you're not a little kid anymore. And you're watching adult cartoons with, people swearing and drinking and, making kind of off-color jokes. And, yeah, then later, yeah, you don't yeah. Like, I still like those shows on occasion too, but it's not like as, they don't seem like as provocative. It's not as, like, thrilling, to watch them the way that it used to be. Yeah, and, like, I think in a way, those shows, yeah, like Family Guy and South Park, I'm wondering, like, just from, like, the perspective of, like, some, tastemaker or critic or something, I think they've kind of managed to, like, obtain the respect of critics, but, I still, like, think broadly they're seen as, like, juvenile, whereas
Hmm.
these other shows you mentioned, these kind of prestige dramas, um, like, yeah, like you said, like, that's what, like, serious TV watchers enjoy, and yeah, yeah, those are the shows that I spend more time watching now.
Then another thing I've noticed, maybe early to mid 20s, at least for me, my preferences have sort of stabilized. And people talk a lot about adolescence as a sensitive period for socialization when you're really influenced by peers and you're really trying to uh, improve your status. And then also brain plasticity wise, increase neuroplasticity during adolescence, especially in cortical regions. And that begins to mature in the 20s. And when I think about this, what I used to do with media, like sort of stepwise graduating. So, graduating from the really kiddie stuff to things like South Park and Family Guy, and graduating from things like that to the more adult TV shows. And I could imagine there are some things that are even like more adult like, especially in academia. You see some of this. A lot of it, though, that I don't really feel the same motivation of I'm gonna do this because it's more mature. A lot of times I'll look at something and say, that's just pretentious. I like what I like. So there's less of that. And I wonder if it's because maybe this is just such a niche bubble, so it's not as appealing, or if it's just a maturity thing, like individually, you're less influenced by those social appeals.
As an adult, yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, do you mean specifically like, like with age? Like, you sort of become more comfortable in your preferences or
Well, what was that show that you mentioned the two Yale students when you were first visiting said you have to
Oh,
watch
West
this?
Wing. Yeah,
So
the
West
West.
Wing, and then you said actually it wasn't very good, but you
Yeah.
felt you had to watch it at the beginning. But you were confident enough in your own taste to say, it's not like you couldn't appreciate it, but everyone else was right and your taste was bad. It's like, no, just objectively, or at least for me, this isn't really good. And I've
No,
never
it's
seen
not a
it.
good show. It's not a good show. I mean, well, I think now I could probably watch it with like, because the thing is like, like, that's the other thing about watching this stuff. Like now, like when you watch a Disney movie, you can appreciate it on multiple levels. But when you're a little kid, you're just watching it because it's like, it's fun and colorful and exciting,
Mhm.
and new. And so like, I watched The West Wing 10 years ago now almost. And I just watched it like just as a show. And I'm like, this is like not, like, it's not interesting. But now I can watch it from the perspective of like, this is a show that, now I know that it had like a really big, like, and profound impact on a certain kind of like highly educated, like prestige driven, like, aspirational elite. And this was like a kind of the early days of prestige television. The show premiered in 1999, and it was like, which was the same year that The Sopranos aired, and like that show was like widely seen as like this landmark in TV history. But so it was The West Wing for that like sort of upper middle class segment of people who wanted their kids to go to, to Ivy League schools. And anyway, yeah, yeah. So I think that's, you become more confident. I'm thinking of even something like like drinking. Uh, like speaking of juvenile stuff, like when I don't know if it was your experience, but when I was a teenager, like even younger than that, I mean, I actually first started drinking beer when I was 5, but I didn't start regularly drinking beer until I was, 13, 14 years old. And I remember, it was disgusting, like the
Mhm.
first, like the first 73 beers you have in your life are like the worst thing you've ever tasted. But when you're around your 13 or 14, your teenage friends, you just want to look tough. And you're like, yeah, I'm drinking this like crappy, bottom shelf beer. Um, but it's beer. You want to look, and then like at a certain point, after you drink a couple hundred, it suddenly starts to taste good, or at least like not bad. And now, like now I'm in my 30s and I'm around other, guys, and there's no, like, I mean, there's no shit. Like, I remember at 21, if you were to order like, like an apple martini or like a wine cooler, you'd be mocked endlessly as a guy for
Mhm.
drinking something like that. Like some like frou-frou, that girly drink or whatever. And now, yeah, like if someone has like a wine cooler or like a lemonade or something, it's like,
You
it's like
just own your
fine.
preferences.
Yeah, you were just like, "I like this, it tastes good," and, like, we don't have to, like, lie to each other about how, "Oh, actually, this, like, super bitter whiskey is better." Although, like, that's the funny thing is, like, now that we kind of know that we can handle those drinks, maybe that's part of it too, is, like, we all collectively understand that, like, yes, we can drink beer, yes, we can drink whiskey, and we can taste it and, like, and on some level appreciate it, and now we can acknowledge that, like, these sugary beverages are, depending on your mood and the occasion and so forth, like, they're actually better in some ways. But first you have to prove that you can handle all this disgusting stuff first, or like, at least initially disgusting. Same with cigarettes. I mean, I think things are changing now with like vapes and like, now I'm seeing like vanilla infused vodkas, and like young people are just like, it's too easy for young people now. Like back in the day, if you wanted to like get like a nicotine rush, you had to like deal with the disgusting old school, like like filtered Marlboros or whatever, and deal with like whatever coughing and, inflame
Mhm.
the
Or
lung.
do the
Like I
choking
remember,
game.
yeah, the choking. Well, yeah, like I remember even later, like once I was able to buy cigarettes, we'd smoke like, especially when I would work graveyard shift in the military, we'd smoke like up to 2 packs a day trying to stay awake. And then like I'd wake up the next morning and like it hurt to breathe. Like I'd had like an inflamed lung. And now it's like you have these vapes and like these kind of like diluted and watered down ways to, everything tastes good now. I just think like there should be a bit of a barrier if you want to like,
Mhm.
you know, poison yourself. And yeah, I was like, there's no more friction to do these things. And I actually wonder if in the short term, vaping is probably healthier than smoking cigarettes, but I wonder if like in the aggregate, in the long run, because it's so much more pleasurable, if like more people are going to do it, and then in the aggregate, the health effects, like the adverse effects will actually kind of even out. But anyway, yeah, yeah, the choking game was another another dumb way that we found to get high.
There's an evolutionary psychologist named Ed Hagen. I
Mm,
think you'd really like this. So he does work on the evolutionary origins of substance use. So he's done research on nicotine, for example, and people automatically seem to smoke at a rate that maintains a certain amount of nicotine in their system, and
mm,
they adjust based on tolerance. So even if you've been smoking for decades and it's like a pack or two a day, well, the reason it's a pack or two a day is because it's not because you actually want more, it's because you want more, like, adjusted to your tolerance. But he's shown that people stabilize at a pretty consistent, like, bloodstream amount. And then the other thing he talked about from a developmental perspective is that, there's definitely the peer pressure element, like you talked about, but there's also developmental changes in our gut microbiome and our immune system. And the idea is that things that taste bitter and toxic to our child selves, well, it's because they literally are. Our immune system isn't strong enough. And then over time, you organically begin to develop this taste for it. And it's almost like chemotherapy. It's like those bad toxins in low doses kill the bad bacteria in your gut once you're an adult with a healthy enough immune system to handle it at a rate much faster than before they're actually harmful to you and your body. So, the alcohol, he he used this to interpret why people develop a taste for alcohol when they're older. Because again, there's definitely the social element, but even things like dark chocolate and drinking coffee black, things like that that I don't think have as much of a peer pressure focus pretty organically. Like now I like dark chocolate more than milk. When I was a kid, I didn't.
mm. Yeah, that is interesting. So your body kind of adapts, and then there's this like evolutionary mechanism that kicks in, and yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that that probably applies, like, yeah, to kind of the kinds of substances that were widely available in the ancestral environment.
Mhm.
But I wonder if, like, with these kind of newly engineered uh, ways to, yeah, to access these drugs, these toxins, like vaping, for example, like smoking tobacco, it's probably been around for a long time, and like ingesting it in some form or another. But like in the form of like, like grape infused, like it just tastes like you're whatever, like you're just like inhaling cotton candy. Like that's like not, like no, like if you presented a substance like that to, a Homo sapien, in the, environment of evolutionary adaptiveness in the Pleistocene, I think they'd be like, I don't know if like they would adjust in that kind of organic way, the way that they would to, smoking a tobacco pipe or something like that, or how, however they would adjust something like that. So, I just wonder like the novel technologies that we're using, something like beer, right? Like beer has always been bitter, but then and like now, like the vodka and the vanilla infused vodkas and like spiked
Mhm.
lemonades and all this other stuff. Like you don't even taste the alcohol if if you like, I could imagine, especially when you're relatively young and inexperienced, that if the only way to get drunk was to drink, some cheap beer versus like, very palatable, super sweet, very pleasant, wine coolers or something like, yeah, more people, well, more people would probably get drunk. So, but I don't know. I don't know. This, yeah, Ed Hagen's work is fascinating.
Mhm.
Anyway, and yeah, the evolutionary angle is interesting.
There's a How I Met Your Mother episode where Barney, the one who's like the main womanizer party guy, is saying new is always better. And he challenges Ted to come up with a counterexample. They're in a bar. He's like, all right, bartender, what's your newest alcohol? What's your oldest? And the newest is like some cheap Starburst flavored vodka. And the oldest is like this super nice, fine aged scotch. And he's like, all right, Barney, your pick. And then he's too stubborn. So he goes with the new vanilla infused Starburst, whatever, and obviously it's terrible.
Yeah, okay, but, I think, yeah, maybe with if you're that age though, like Barney and the other guy, like they probably, they're older, they've grown up with different these are fictional characters, whatever, but like,
Uh-huh.
you've adjusted and you're accustomed to quality and you appreciate the bitterness. But yeah, if you're a teenager or you're just starting out in your what will hopefully be a long and thrilling drinking career, the Starburst drink might actually be better,
Mhm.
and could lead to like increased alcohol consumption over time. And yeah, yeah, it's interesting to sort of think about these things. Like, I just think like the kind of like the male sort of macho desire. When I was writing the book and writing those chapters when I was a kid, of just like, even something like the choking game, yeah, like drinking beer, any of these things. Like, it was like half of it was about getting high, and like the sort of the immediate physical experience of like escape and the kind of euphoria. But then, like, a large reason why, another big reason why we wanted to do these things, is just to like look tough to each other, and to like not want to like appear physically or mentally cowardly.
Right. That innate desire for toughness and risk taking, especially in men. We were talking off camera about having certain controversial interests in academia and how that, on one hand, sort of places a target on you, but could be seen as bravery. And I was talking with Roy Baumeister about this last semester. He was visiting Harvard. And, I've got my research interest on puberty and hormones. And lately, I've been interested in the effects of puberty blockers on brain development in transgender youth. So this is highly politicized on both ends. And you and he were telling me this is brave. And I was thinking, well, in academia, this is like as cushy as it gets. But if I'm
Mm,
still in my early 20s and I've got this young, still developing, testosterone fueled brain that is primed for risk taking, well, within this environment, this is what risk taking and combat looks like. So it's like, even there, you can't avoid maybe this innate evolutionary drive
mm.
to either aggress or risk take.
Yeah, yeah, it kind of expresses itself based on, yeah, your kind of like personality profile and preferences, and then yeah, your environment too. That yeah, like like, where are the boundaries? How do you kind of test the limits of what's acceptable, and how do you get maybe a bit of a reaction from people in on an elite college campus, and some of it, yeah, maybe doing the kind of provocative research and things that may raise eyebrows, or it can be, joining some kind of, like political demonstration or kind of activist cause. And, I do think like, yeah, there was kind of an interesting paper. Well, there've been a couple of interesting papers on this. So one was from Mitch Brown. I don't know if you follow him.
No.
I think his name is Mitch Brown. I hope I'm getting that name right. I know the name is Brown, definitely, but he's an evolutionary researcher, and he and his co-authors wrote this paper, in which they essentially found that, something like, I don't know if it was sociosexual orientation or some kind of like need for mating. They had one of these interesting constructs correlated with like interest in political activism. And, the idea here being that, if you're a young person and you're interested in, exhibiting desirable traits to the opposite sex, like, standing up for a righteous cause and exhibiting like willingness to be sort of physically combative in the in the quest to do that, there's a bit of that. Jonathan Haidt, one of his essays, he said something like this, like, young people's, especially young men's minds are kind of wired. I don't know if he used that language, but they're essentially wired for this kind of, you know, intercoalitionary conflict. And, on the modern college campus, it can sort of take the form of, identifying scapegoats and, kind of getting involved in the sort of verbal combat and demonstrations and picketing and, trying to get people fired or trying to whatever it is. So yeah, it is interesting, like how the kind of underlying evolutionary impulses at the lower level can kind of manifest at these higher levels in the kind of local context of a university system where, you can't like, if at Harvard or Cambridge or whatever, you can't punch someone in the face, but
Mhm.
you can kind of, get some people together and sign a petition and or lock yourself in the university president's office and, like block people from entering or exiting or what have you. And those are other ways to kind of demonstrate your uh, physical formidability and willingness to take risks.
Jordan Peterson's talked about this in his lectures on John Piaget, who's got these developmental stages. I think it's sensory, motor, then pre-operational, formal operational, by which at age 12 or so, you start to be able to engage in these hypotheticals and complex reasoning that adults can do. And that's where it generally ends in the psychology textbooks. And then Peterson mentioned that Piaget, from his biography, also had these intense interests in philosophy of religion and reconciling this with psychology and with development. And that he also talked about this messianic stage into adolescence and young adulthood, where people now equipped with this cognitive capacity and independence and responsibility essentially want to like pick up a noble burden and save the world. And, you know, to put an optimistic spin on it, you do sort of see that with this activism. Maybe it's misguided in some ways, but if you just strip it to the bare bones moral sense, it's like, you know, something like climate change. This is an emergency, and I need to do my part and do everything I can to essentially help save the world. It's kind of grandiose. It could get narcissistic, especially if it's like you think a protest on a rich college campus is going to like change the world. But there's that messianic moral sentiment that could be really admirable.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that most of the people who participate, like the evolutionary impulses and all this stuff, like I'm not saying like these are conscious or deliberate or like they have self-interested. I mean, like not consciously self-interested. Like I think like at the kind of surface, explicit level that most of the people who do these things believe that they're doing the right thing and that they're not doing them for selfish reasons or for exhibitionistic reasons or for narcissistic reasons. They are, this is like kind of classic Robert Trivers self-deception stuff that, if you want to believe that you're doing something, if you want to convince others that you're doing something good, you have to first convince yourself that it's a good cause. And so, yeah, but the thing is, like a lot of the activism, these are like a lot of young people where, they, like, if you sort of take the state, like the Piaget stages seriously, um, they haven't actually accomplished, sort of every stage along the way. And like a lot of these young people, they haven't yet, you know, determined their career paths, and they haven't reached a position where, like this is like, a sort of Jordan Peterson idea too, that, you have to ensure that you are equipped to take care of yourself and your community and those around you before you go off and try to change the world. And this is a point that I don't know if you've read Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Have you read that?
No.
Flow's a really good book. The Psychology of Optimal Experience. Everyone knows what flow is now. It's kind of broken through as like a popular term, but the book is worth reading. And Csikszentmihalyi talks about the similar idea of trying to first ensure that you are in a good place mentally and physically and psychologically, spiritually. I don't know if he uses the term spiritual, but just ensure that you and those around you are cared for before you go off and attempt to transform the world for everyone else. And there have been good causes like this. Like I think there was a cause, I don't know how recent it was, but I remember some Harvard students did some kind of petition and some demonstration for some of the like the custodial staff at Harvard, like attempting to increase their wages. And if I'm not mistaken, they actually succeeded in this endeavor. And like that would be an example of this, of like, there's like a clear, concrete, measurable outcome, and you're actually helping the people who need it. And you are, and it's in your local community. And I think something like that versus like, some kind of abstract ideal of social justice or something where, like there's no specific target in mind, and you wouldn't know whether you've accomplished your goals or not. Anyway, yeah. So I think it's an interesting point though, that like, yes, most of them do think they're doing the right thing.
Our first podcast, we talked pretty broadly about your upbringing and sort of this nature nurture question. This was before Trouble came out, about, given certain disadvantaged circumstances, why did you succeed where others failed? Like, could there be something about your genetics, born smarter, maybe more conscientious, other niche features about your environment that contributed to your success? And you didn't talk about fighting last time, but this is
Mm.
another new thing I learned from the book that from a young age, was it boxing or some other form of MMA?
Yeah, yeah, it was Muay Thai.
Right, and talking about how motivated you were as a teenager to, like, show up and train and all of that conscientiousness, it's like the seeds were clearly already there, maybe not in an academic context, but that was another thing that struck me because clearly there it's just part of your personality from a young age, or maybe this martial arts experience fostered that in you, but I was under the impression originally that you didn't get the discipline until military service.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's right. Like, you know, I I think, like, hmm, a lot of the raw ingredients were there for me to kind of, achieve achieve kind of the conventional metrics of accomplishment of college and career and all those kinds of things, but there's role for environment too. So yes, like, I was kind of more academically inclined than my friends, probably more conscientious than them too. And I think that kind of comes through in the book in some ways of, like, my willingness to do work or chores or boxing or any of those things. Like, I had this interest. I read a lot, so a lot of the kind of raw materials were there. But I was in, like, such a kind of chaotic and disorderly environment that you know intelligence and conscientiousness are necessary but not sufficient to
Mhm.
succeed. Uh, you also need to be in a kind of predictable and stable environment that can channel those good qualities and allow them to manifest themselves. And it's like a complete, the kind of deteriorating working class communities in the US, those aren't like, there are probably a lot of smart kids who could be going to college. There was this really interesting study from this Harvard economist actually recently where he estimated that there's something like 25,000 kids from low to middle income families in the US that would qualify for admission to an Ivy plus college. But a lot of them, they don't apply for various reasons. But I think a lot of them, they are just in situations where, like, they were in situations like mine, where maybe you have some talents and some aptitude, but, like, no one's trying to inculcate good habits. There are no good role models. There's nothing sort of pushing you to express that. Whereas in, like, upper middle class communities, like Roland Fryer has this joke about how, like if like you're a little kid and you raise your leg, someone's like, "Oh, you should be, just look, we should enroll you in ballet." Like, they're
Yeah.
constantly monitoring you. Like, it's like they're almost like BF Skinner, like looking at your behavior and like, "Oh, you did this. Well, let's reward that." Like, and try to give some positive reinforcement where you're not really getting that in like poor and working class areas, nearly to the same extent. And so, yeah, it was hard, like, and, like, have a lot of those negative experiences that I had, I write, I think it is in the preface that, when you're let down repeatedly by adults in your life as a kid, you eventually learn to let yourself down. And so there were, like, as an adult, and especially once I got to the military, like, it started to become clear to me that I was, like, a conventionally smart person, but I didn't really want to fully accept that. I didn't really want to even raise my sights for myself. There was a period where I was just very comfortable on, autopilot, so to speak, of just, like, going through the motions, going to work, ticking the right boxes, clocking in, clocking out. Like, I put in the effort and I got early promotions and I, got the pats on the back and the good performance reports. But, like, everything was there. All the, I didn't have to think. Like, the expectations were laid out. Here are your duties. Do them well. I did them. And I didn't have to start to think about, like, raising my ambitions for myself or truly thinking about what I wanted because, that would have required me to acknowledge something about myself that I wasn't prepared to acknowledge. Uh, and a lot of those kind of uh, self beliefs form in early childhood about yourself, about your relationships, about your identity, and like being smart was never like a big identity to me. It wasn't important to me. Whereas for a lot of kids, it does become their an important piece for them. And so he's like all the fighting and stuff in the book. I mean, the funny thing is like I didn't even write about every fight. And like I think I lose most of the fights in the book too. Like I didn't want it to be like, look how cool and badass I was. It was more like this is just like a kind of a characteristic of these, like in foster care, working class communities, poor areas of just like young boys together without fathers in kind of neglectful homes. And,
Hmm.
they just want to like beat each other up and show each other how strong they are and act very impulsively. And, in hindsight, it was kind of crazy to think about like imagine getting into a fist fight at 7:45 in the morning. But like
Right.
that was pretty normal at my high school. Like you'd show up to class or like show up to like early, and it would be like, like two kids throwing down by the lockers. And it was like now at 7:45, I can barely move. But back then it was like everyone was kind of like on edge. You have that like youthful energy, but then like everyone was drinking like cheap energy drinks and like all the hormones and all of that stuff, like combined with the lack of parenting and the lack of oversight. And yeah, it gets, sort of that like Lord of the Rings-esque vibe.
I was comparing this to my own childhood, and I was trying to figure out how much of it might be differences maybe in the severity of deprivation. Because like I grew up in a poor working class community with a single mom as well, but it wasn't really violent. And, it could just be that some areas are more violent than others, and Red Bluff was one of those. It could also be a generational thing. Cause like for me, where that major outlet was on video games. And I think for most of my peers, it's like everyone goes home, plays Call of Duty, like so they're really violent. You're shooting at each other, but less so personally. And then also exercise wise, like I didn't exercise. I think I was on the worst end of the spectrum for that, but overall generationally, I'm sure today's generations are less physically active than we used to be.
That's actually really helpful for me because people have asked me about this, about like, is it like the generational thing? Like, because people have seen these statistics of like more and more young people are, you've probably seen like some of Gene Twangy's work and some others about fewer teenagers are working or entering relationships, drinking, having sex, like all of the kind of, in decades past, these indicators of maturation and transitioning to adulthood have declined. And I've wondered if that's a generational divide and how much of it is also class. Like I wonder, like, if you're a teenager in a working class community, if like those things are still happening. Because, like when I read Jean Twenge's recent book, Generations, really good book, when she was describing the kind of behavioral and like the attributes and experiences of Gen X, I recognize that in my experience as like a kind of like a millennial. Um, and I wonder if there's that kind of like delay where the kind of hallmarks of each generation, there's a kind of slight lag
Mhm.
where, yeah, like the characteristics we identify with Gen X was actually occurring for millennials, but just kind of 10 or 15 years behind. And so, yeah, like there was like a lot of latchkey kids and a lot of kind of neglect and a lot of like that characteristic Gen Z feeling of alienation and burnout and um, suspicion of authority. And like the millennials, like my impression is like the stereotype of the millennial is someone who's more sort of earnest, less ironic, like more, like whatever, just like more kind of idealistic in some ways
Mhm.
versus Gen X. But like we didn't have that. Like that was not what I, at least in my memory, that's not what I can recall. So uh where was I going with this? Oh yeah. Yeah, that's helpful for me. Your experiences. It sounds like you're a Gen are you Gen Z? Are you a
I'm
Zoomer?
like at the old end of Zoomers. Yeah.
Okay. So as a Zoomer who grew up in a working class community, single mom, that it was more video games. Yeah, I think I just missed like everything about my life. Like I kind of just missed the transition. So I left home in 2000. Well, it's 2006 I moved out, but I enlisted in 2007 when I was 17. And that was like right before smartphones. Like wait, I had a Motorola Razor when I graduated high school. And, like, I think it was still like a pay by the SMS, you'd pay like 10 cents per message,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Um, we had an Xbox 360. I lived with these two brothers in my high school senior year, but we didn't have like internet, no like Xbox Live, all that stuff like picked up like 2 to 3 years later. And so, yeah, I remember I lived in a house when I was enlisted later. I was like 19 or 20 years old. And yeah, we had Xbox Live installed. We had like Call of Duty started, Halo, all that stuff started to pick up. But I think like, I graduated kind of 4 or 5 years before video games became this like huge phenomenon. Um, yeah, the Xbox 360, I think that kind of marked a transition into like really good video games compared to like the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. And, like, those were fun too, but, like, not, like, especially once you can connect to the internet and, like, you can play for hours with different people, and it just adds another layer of excitement. So, yeah, I kind of, yeah, that makes sense to me that, like, as a teenage boy, that once you have access to that, you're not, like, gonna, like, go joyriding with your friends and find those
Mhm.
other kind of more dangerous avenues for excitement.
In your podcast with Chris Williamson, he asked, what about living in poverty do people usually fail to understand? And one thing that I was thinking there is, it sounds so dramatic, right? Living in poverty, like it has these connotations of extreme deprivation, like you don't have enough to eat, you don't have an Xbox or anything like that. But in my experience, it sounds like in yours as well, it's like you still do have a lot of those things, even Xbox, TV, maybe iPhone, but it's so uh, wasteful in a way. Like it represents a much larger proportion of your income to spend like those few $100s on the Xbox or on the phone. And I think this contributes to why we're living paycheck to paycheck because in some sense, I felt more normal, like even compared to other more middle class or upper middle class families. They had largely a lot of the same things, but it was still like, you know, that was so much more money to us, and in some ways, uh, a much less wise purchase because it wasn't the same as, like, you're just spending this much money on a hobby. It's more like even for my mom, I remember we got, like, a $500 bigger TV at one point, and she was more or less living paycheck to paycheck and probably making, like, $2,000 a month. So we did invest in a $500 TV, but that was like a quarter of her monthly income, and it was a bit that had to be saved over many months. And I look at that thinking, well, with a higher amount of income, most people wouldn't invest like that large a proportion of their income to something as kind of frivolous as TV. But when you're growing up poorer, it's not like the norms are that much shifted that you're just not gonna spend money on the same things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, one of the things I told Chris was, like poverty is a relative term now, especially in like kind of developed first world countries that, when you spend time visiting developing countries, poor countries, like poverty just takes on a different meaning. Like I read Mike Tyson's autobiography a couple of years ago, and he tells this story about, he grew up in Brownsville, in New York, single mom, super poor, um, and he would write about how he was embarrassed because he'd go to school wearing these like old tennis shoes, and kids would make fun of him for these beat up old sneakers. And then later he becomes heavyweight champion, travels the world. He visited some village in Mexico, and he was like, the poor kids in Mexico like don't have shoes. And that was like this big kind
Mhm.
of eye-opening experience that I got made fun of for wearing old shoes, but these kids have no shoes. And I had kind of had a similar experience when I went to Malaysia a couple of years ago for the first time. And like, I had this like dishwashing job. I made 6.75 an hour. I could barely make ends meet. I was, underage. I was just like struggling to get by on this job. And then I, went to this poor country and like even like the dishwashing station, it was like literally like a water hose and like two worn down rubber buckets, like not even a proper sink, like and they
Mhm.
were probably making the equivalent of like $1 an hour, which even adjusting for purchasing power, they were earning less than what I was making on my job. And it was like, yeah, being a dishwasher sucks in 2006 in America, but it sucks like way more in this kind of impoverished country. And so, just like thinking about poverty. And so when I was growing up, yes, we grew up poor, but it was like, I used this term squalor with Chris of like, people just kind of making self-defeating decisions, like even something like credit card debt. Yeah, I would see people like, like my friend's stepdad would buy like a big screen TV on credit, but then they wouldn't have furniture. Like they would have like patio furniture, like plastic chairs in their
Mhm.
house. Because, for the, his stepdad, it was like, who cares what your couch looks like? Like I want the I want the flat screen TV to watch the Super Bowl. And so it was like a kind of a weird and it was sad because then, like, they would buy the TV, but then they'd have to, like, run from bill collectors and, like, borrow money to pay off the debt, and it was just this kind of ongoing, like, financial humiliation for the family, despite the fact that, yeah, they had a house and they had furniture, they had a big TV, but just making those kinds of decisions like that. Um, and then there's like rampant drug use and like families forming and shifting and infidelity. And I mean, in a weird way, like I think a lot of the squalor that we see in a lot of kind of poor and working class communities is almost like a weird side effect of material abundance, of like
Mhm.
the fact that you can even obtain a flat screen TV on credit. Like that's something you can't do in actual sort of like abject extreme poverty in other countries. Um, or even like the obesity. Like a lot of people are probably familiar with the fact that there's an inverse correlation now between wealth and obesity in rich countries. And, it's like it's hard when you can like when food is hyper palatable. And I know people talk about food deserts and stuff, but like it's not food deserts. It's the fact that like generic Pop Tarts from Walmart just taste better than broccoli. Like even if you could afford the
Mhm.
vegetables, like the fact that a lot of this food has just been engineered by food scientists to taste extra good, that's what people are drawn. So, there's a lot of like overeating, a lot of indulging in appetites, a lot of people who, yeah, aren't particularly high in conscientiousness, don't have a lot of education, but they kind of have access to these avenues of, yeah, just hurting themselves. And that isn't due to lack of material abundance, but kind of the like excesses in a way.
That's something that I think is miscommunicated a lot. The idea that people are often overweight because cheaper food is unhealthier. Like the cheapest food, if you look at it, is like rice, beans, potatoes. If anyone's ever serious in food insecurity, like you can buy like a 5 pound bag of potatoes for like
Mhm.
$4 and
Yeah.
that'll feed you for a long time. But it's not just that. It's like there's two variables you have to consider. There's the price, but then there's also something like taste and convenience. And as you mentioned, these unhealthy things are much more tasty and much more convenient. And so it seems related to something about like either the conscientiousness or whatever the culture is, because there's not this rational mindset of, oh, even if you're already in a low income community and you're spending a bunch of money on fast food, not only could you save money by like eating rice and beans and vegetables and like these healthier, cleaner meals, but it's just really effortful. People don't do it.
Yeah. And it helps to have, a point that I make in my book, or, about the importance of family stability and having
Hmm.
two parents, preferably two married parents is, there was a period in my childhood where I like, whenever I was raised by a two-parent family, after I was adopted out of the homes, there was a period I was adopted by my adoptive mother and her husband, who was temporarily my adoptive father. We actually had like sit down meals and like, yeah, we didn't have much money. My adoptive father was a truck driver. My mom was an assistant social worker, and we had a house. And like we could make ends meet. It wasn't. It's kind of, I
Hmm.
guess, at that point financially, maybe somewhere around lower middle class actually. But yeah, they would cook meals. We'd have like whatever, like vegetables and like a proper dinner. Um, but then, like, later, when I was raised by a single mom for a while after they divorced, like, my mom was just too busy, with work and all of her obligations trying to make ends meet, and I was this latchkey kid, and then it was, like, back to, junk food and, cheap fruit roll-ups and whatever, just like, and yeah, fast food, 29-cent Tuesdays at McDonald's, and then
Hmm.
she, entered a relationship with this woman named Shelly, who I write about in the book, and they raised me into adolescence, and again, we returned to, like, sit-down meals, and they had time, and, the, just having two adults around just like increases the likelihood that there will actually be kind of that ritual of family dinner time. And then we had proper meals again, and then, more sort of financial catastrophes and other, situations arose. And again, it was like the meals and everything else became worse, as a consequence. And it,
Hmm.
returning to junk food and snack foods. And so it's just, yeah, it's a cultural issue. It's, to some extent it's a material issue, but then it's just a matter of like time and preference and the willingness of adults, so I'm talking specifically about the experience of a child, the willingness of adults to kind of, commit to ensuring that a kid is, eating proper meals and instead of just taking the easiest possible option, which is understandable if you're a single parent and you don't have a lot of time to just and of course, like the kid is going to whine. That was the other thing that was funny, like when it was my mom and Shelly and me and my sister was an extremely nitpicky eater. And so we'd sit down and we'd have whatever, like chicken and some whatever, like cabbage and potatoes, whatever it was. Like, I don't know, just basic kind of typical American family dinner.
Hmm.
Um, and then my sister would like start whining and saying she wanted to eat a corn dog or she wanted to order pizza or she wanted like the junk, that every kid likes. And like my mom and Shelly would like have to like battle her on this until she would finally relent and just like eat this like much healthier meal instead of whatever, like eating frozen chicken nuggets that every kid would prefer to eat, quite frankly. Um, but if you're a single mom and you're stressed out and you just got off a 10-hour shift and, it's just you don't have another parent to kind of play tag team with to support you. You're just going to like, of course, open the freezer and pull out the corn dogs and just like give the kids some food so that they'll leave you alone and you can have a peaceful home. Like all of those layers, right? Like Melissa Carney writes at length about this in the two parent privilege of just, all of these, factors that people who are, accustomed to having intact families don't even think about.
Yeah, that stability piece is absolutely critical, more so than the money. Like when my mom would buy fast food for us, I think if anything, she'd spend more. Like, this was maybe a decade or after the 29-cent hamburgers you're talking about. So it's more like, $2 if you're getting the cheaper kind, $4 if it's like more the meal. So let's say we're spending like $8 on fast food versus you're making like chicken and rice and vegetables probably for less than $8, but obviously there's the investment of the cooking and like doing the sit down dinner and it's just easier not to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, you just want to, sort of take the easiest option, and you want your kid to be happy too, and, like, when you're when you have the habit and the routine and you have another adult there, like, you kind of are more willing to incur the cost of short-term pain of battling your little kid who wants pizza, um, versus if you're a single parent and you're frazzled and you're, stretched so thin, and you just want the kid to be happy, you want them to smile, and you just say like, "Okay, we'll order some Burger King, and, you can have this meal, and you'll be happy, and I'll be happy," and, it's just easier that way. I totally understand it, but, this is like a kind of downstream effect of like why kids in general are increasingly obese because families are increasingly
Mhm.
deteriorating. Like those two things are directly connected. And then especially why obesity is so prevalent in low income communities among, adults, but also for kids, right? Like, and it's a shame because like the kids are just doing what little kids want to do, which is just like eat hyper palatable, tasty foods. But as adults, we should be thinking more about like how to how to create the conditions such that even if the kid in the short term wants that unhealthy food, in the long term, we know like what's best for them and how to, give them a proper diet and make sure that they don't have all of the accompanying health issues, right? Like if you're an obese 5-year-old, like the likelihood that you're going to have severe health issues and as an adult just skyrocket. And like this is going to be like, I hate to sound like some like nerdy, like social scientist economist or something, but like it's going to be a burden on like everything on the healthcare system, on employment, on every other thing.
Mhm.
But the main thing that I focus on in the book is about the sort of phenomenological firsthand experience of the child of just like the kid just wants immediate comfort too, right? Like a little kid in those environments are stressed out and they don't have a dad or they don't have a mom or they're just like, they just want to take like the shortest route to gratification. And if they had two parents in a loving environment, like they're also going to be like less likely to seek out those hedonistic, short-term, temporary, avenues of relief in the form of tasty junk food or drugs or thrill seeking.
This is something I've wrestled with a lot over the last few years because I was obese as a teenager. And there's a part of me that looks back on that thinking like if I'd asked my mom for ice cream and she gives in, then almost being resentful about it, thinking that wasn't in my best interest. But then also thinking, she wants to make me happy. She's stressed out. I, I, as a kid, that did make me happy amidst a whole lot of other suffering. Although aside from the health impacts, you get bullied for being overweight. It plummets your self esteem. So, all of these things, and thinking about it almost in this who's to blame way. So, like, if not to blame the parent, then do you blame the system? This got me interested in these broader, like, nature nurture questions about free will and determinism. And you mentioned briefly that you went through some resentful phases and kind of they got better with age. But did you find yourself asking those same types of questions? Like, you could blame, say, your birth parents for abandoning you and be resentful towards them. But then if you zoom out far enough, you can say, like, well, they were born into probably harsh circumstances as well. Addiction just takes over people's lives and it's not their fault. So you start to empathize with them as individuals more, the more determinist you are. But then you kind of just wind up shaking your fist at the sky like it's a random roll of dice.
Yeah. I mean, once I became old enough to really reflect and introspect and consider like the sequence of events in my life that, yeah, I would feel that resentment. I wouldn't feel it. Yeah. Not like as a kid or, I mean, to some extent as a teenager, I did experience that. There was a part of the book where I described my reaction to my mom and Shelly separating and my like just like all of the rage and anger that I had felt kind of like suddenly rose to the surface in that moment. But so it had clearly been sort of simmering within me. But it wasn't like these weren't conscious thoughts. Like I think that maybe the resentment was always there, but it wasn't until I reached the age and like a certain kind of event would suddenly set it off that I would act out. But yeah, it was, and then, yeah, later as a young adult, these thoughts would rise to the surface and yeah, it's, yeah, shaking your fist at the sky, like, no one yeah, once I yeah, when I finally kind of consciously cooked for me that, all of these adults in my life, from my birth parents to the foster parents to the social workers, the entire foster system that I grew up in, my adoptive parents, there were just such an abdication of responsibility along the way, but it's not as if I could return to each one of those people and somehow, like, negotiate, compensation for my experiences or get them to do something for me. Um, and in many cases, a lot of those people they have their own, issues I'm sure that they were dealing with, and they weren't going to fix my circumstances, only I could fix it. And, like, once I fully accepted responsibility for my life and kind of recognized that, you know, there's no one else who's going to be able to fix this. Um, not just my external circumstances, but my internal feelings about it. Like I'm not going to receive an apology from any of these people. Uh, that once I accepted all of that, then that's when things kind of started to turn around for me. And that's when, I really started to, in a very sort of conscious, explicit way, start planning and preparing for my future. Because before that, even enlisting in the military was kind of this half impulsive decision. Everything along the way was just, I was doing it because I was told, and because it was, in a weird way, it was easy. Like, doing the things weren't easy, but the fact that I had this kind of outline in place of like, do these things, like that was easy in a way of just like having the rigid
Mhm.
structure and the expectations laid out very clearly. And I didn't have to think so much about like, is this what I want? How do I plan for my own future and start making my own decisions and sort of take that leap on my own. Um, but yeah, it took, I was 24 when I really started to do this. And it really didn't fully click for me until I was 28, actually. that I really sort of fully accepted that it wasn't just about myself and my own desires, my own um, interest in like self-reliance, which I think is important for a lot of young people. Like you do go through this kind of full circle phase of initially you, as a kid, you naturally have to rely on people for your survival. And in my case, I just had to rely on very unreliable adults. And then, set between like 17 and really from 17 to like 28, it was more like self-reliance of like, okay, now I'm on my own. I have to figure this out. I have to extricate myself from everything and everyone and figure out how to make my own way in the world. And then I came to this recognition that, you know, that mindset was probably helpful and adaptive during those years of my teens and 20s. But ultimately, the aim is to be the kind of person that I didn't have when I was growing up, to be that kind of adult that other people could rely on, um, and to be someone that other people could, come to and trust and yeah, sort of foster the conditions of safety and security and all of those things that I had so lacked when I was a kid.
You see parallels of all of that on a whole cultural level going on nowadays, like whether it's going to be this sort of top-down recognition of inequality and top-down intervention trying to fix it as if it's not up to the individual versus this bottom-up adoption of responsibility, even if it's unfair circumstances, it seems like it's the only thing that actually makes it better. And conservatives have embraced that. And you do see the pendulum swinging back a little bit. But for the most part, it's a really unpopular message. And why do you think that is? Why do you think we struggle with that?
Um, is it unpopular? I think it's unpopular among elites, especially political elites, historically primarily on the left, but also on the right. It's just so much more satisfying and more expedient to blame systems or to blame the other. Like on the left, yeah, blaming sort of these abstract systems or systemic forces, and then on the right, blaming whatever, like immigrants or group, whatever, like whatever it happens to be, or the left, or whatever, like liberal elites or whatever it is. Um, and yeah, and on the left, they'll blame whatever, like the 1% or the billionaires. I mean, everyone wants to blame, but yeah, it's not as easy to kind of advertise this idea that actually it's you. Like ultimately, everything that happens in your life, even if it's not your fault, it's still your responsibility. Um, a lot of the things that happen in our lives aren't our fault, especially when we're kids, but the people who mistreated you or who, contributed to your misfortunes, it's, like they're not going to fix it. You're the only one who ultimately has the control and the agency and the ability to make any change in your life, however incremental. It's not going to be overnight, but I think you know, an audience out there or people out there who are open to that message. I think the popularity of people like Jordan Peterson or Jocko Willink or David Goggins or, like these are people who are kind of promoting that message that it's you
Mhm.
that has to do this. And, I think there are, you know, to give the left credit, like there are sort of systemic issues and there are um, forces beyond our individual control that do contribute to a lot of misery and a lot of strife. But most of us at the individual level can't change a system overnight, but we can change like what we do next. Um, like literally what you do next, as far as like how to take care of yourself or take care of those around you. I mean, even something like your health, you can blame the food industry or you can blame advertisers or whatever, or you could drop down like literally right now and do 10 push-ups. Like that
Right.
is actually something you can do in that moment, but no one's going to do that. I mean, some people might, but like that's just not something that is easy to sell. Um, but again, I think there's an audience out there for it.
The other big surprise for me in your book was that we've been talking almost as if this is kind of a linear story of gradually self-improving and adopting more responsibility and gaining more clarity of your situation around you. But you talk about your struggles with alcohol addiction during your military service, and I had no idea about that. And you describe in the book how most people in your life didn't even know, because here you were succeeding at your job and things seemed to be progressing, and then at the same time you had all of this inner conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of successful people actually uh, have written to me and told me like that they could connect with that, even if they themselves weren't suffering from substance abuse. Just this, this the that just that dichotomy of like the external surface level, you feel very successful, your people are applauding you or patting you on the back for your accomplishments, but internally there's this feeling of doubt or anxiety or insecurity or um, this lingering feeling of like, are you worthy of this success? And yeah, I experienced that in my early 20s of, I mean, really like the kind of issues with alcohol, they they probably started from, I mean, even maybe before my adolescence, but really the book in some ways is like an implicit defense of like limitations and boundaries and restrictions and all those things, because, like, when I was a teenager, I could drink, but there was still friction. Like, you still had to, like, find someone who was 21 and, like, you still had like, like, money too. Like, we couldn't always afford it, but we had to, like, scrape together some cash, find someone's older brother or someone's coworker or whatever. Like, you still had to, like, overcome these barriers in order to get drunk. But by the time I was an adult and I was earning a regular paycheck and I was around other people who liked to drink a lot and alcohol was freely available and easily accessible, it was just getting off work and then just like pounding 10 beers was like a normal day. Or like, yeah, just like drinking, like whatever, like buy like a big gulp from 7 Up and then just like, spike it with a bunch of vodka and then, like, I'd go drive like that. Um, and no one was telling me no, and there was no, like, immediate consequence for this kind of behavior. And so it was like, enough resources with enough time, with enough, with easy access, all of those things, this confluence of factors led to me just, like, completely overindulging in this. And, but I also wanted to be successful. I wanted to impress people. I wanted to succeed and, you know, play the game right. And I got a lot of satisfaction, just personal satisfaction from, receiving promotions and impressing my bosses and then later, once I achieved a high enough rank of like, having subordinates who respected me. And that was like this tightrope that I was constantly walking. And yeah, at a certain point, it just became too much for me. I mean, by the time I had alcohol poisoning, and that probably wasn't the first time, but that was like the worst time that I had it, where I had to go to the hospital. But there were like other things like that contributed even further to my stress. My girlfriend at the time had recently split with me. I had a coworker who I got along with and I really liked who had committed suicide. And it was just like, one thing after another seemingly at that time. And yeah, I just like over, you know, really overdid it. And yeah, the next day I woke up in a hospital. So it was just that was like one of the harder chapters to write, because I hadn't really ever publicly discussed that before. And you know, it was also like the a kind of adult retrospective chapter of me kind of thinking more about my early life and experiences. And it was hard, it was hard to do that.
Was it therapeutic
I mean, not I don't know, not like to write it, you mean? Or
to write it, or now
uh,
having it out there and talking about it,
oh,
hearing that
I
people
don't know,
resonate?
therapeutic. I don't know. I mean, it's nice. It's nice when I receive messages from people who've had difficult experiences themselves and connect with the story. But writing it or like that, I don't know if it was there. I mean, you know, if you want to have a therapeutic experience, you got to go to therapy, which is actually something that I did when I was there. in rehab. Um, but writing it, no, it was just hard. It wasn't really cathartic or anything. It was just like a difficult thing. I'm glad I did it, and it was more like I'm glad I did it, but I wasn't, uh, you know, I wasn't like full of joy when I was writing it. It was more just difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, all of that was hard to imagine, and even other earlier things in the book that you mentioned, like the getting into the fights or a lot of this anger and resentment that you were dealing with. Because I've really only known you in this phase of your life sort of as, like, an academic, very well-spoken, calm voice. So, like, imagining you, like, getting alcohol poisoning or getting angry or getting into a fist fight, all of those things, they make sense given the circumstances, but there's that disjunction with, I guess, your current life. Do you experience that personally? Like, sort of disconnect between past and present Rob?
Yeah, well, I'm in my 30s now, and like just in general, people change over time. I mean, the same person at 17 versus 24 versus 34, those are just very different ages in general, regardless of the circumstances of the person's life. But, I guess like part of the reason why I, am in a position to write a book is because like my story was like particularly dramatic. The changes and phases and transformations and everything. I mean, you know, like I changed a lot between 17 and 25. When I first enlisted, I was 17. I was I was technically underage. I was like, legally still a child, so I had to have my adoptive mom sign a permission slip for me. So like I left when I was still a kid, um, enlisted, and then I got out when I was 25. And like those are dramatic changes. Like those years, dramatic changes occur for young people, young men anyway. Um, but I spent those 8 years in the military. And that's a long time. I mean, 8 years, and those are like, the most formative years for a lot of young people, late teens to mid
Mhm.
20s, when you undergo dramatic changes mentally, physically, physiologically, neurologically. You just change a lot. But I was in a particularly unique environment. Um, and I had this like, kind of unique job and was in a situation where high expectations were thrust on me, and I was traveling a lot and stationed in different places. I lived in Germany. I was deployed to the Middle East a couple of times. Like it was just, very, um, just varied situations and circumstances where you kind of have to rapidly mature very quickly. And that's what happened. By the time I was 25, like during my military experience, I didn't just, go from being a kid to being an adult or a boy to a man, but I also just like, whatever, like I went from kind of working class to middle class in terms of my income and circumstance, like just so many dramatic changes during those 8 years. So, naturally, I appear different and present differently than I did when I left home. Um, Role models, peers, everything changed so much. Um, but yeah, it is like that was a unique like writing the book from the perspective of my age at those different points of my life and trying to sort of recapture the feelings that I had. I was surprised actually. Um, yeah, like recalling how much anger I had or how uh much rage and how much resentment and all of those things. Like, yeah, those are still like, it wasn't that hard to access them. So, in some ways, I almost wonder if like part of the reason why I'm pretty calm and it's just because like my life is so much better. I wonder
Mhm.
if like I moved back to Red Bluff, got a job there, same people, same everything, like all of that stuff may just like bubble back up. But I'm in a situation where like I have money, I have like, like there's no like real friction in my life anymore. So like, it's just that's, like, the other thing that people maybe don't fully grasp about growing up poor, growing up in squalor, those kinds of things is, like, even if you are temperamentally pretty even-keeled, it's just, like, so like, the people around you, like, you just have, like, impulsive people around you. You have to kind of almost put up a kind of, tough exterior. all those kinds of things. Like, you adapt to your circumstances in that way. Whereas now, like everyone around me is soft, so I can afford to be a little bit soft too, in a way that I couldn't, 15 plus years ago.
That's why I was a little surprised that you didn't have that same attitude of academic conflict isn't real conflict. If anything, it's kind of fun, like just leaning into it, knowing that you can take real punches, let alone these academic blows.
Yeah, I mean, like I called you intellectually courageous before, and for some of the work you're doing. And it's funny, like people, yeah, I think it's funny, like people have said that to me, especially when I was writing when I was still in grad school, some of the things that I was describing and publicly writing about. And and yeah, I guess in a way, like it's weird. Like I almost had that same reaction that you had of like, yeah, is this really courageous? Is this really brave? But I thought about like in the context maybe, right? Like because I have known people who have gotten fired for saying like literally the exact same things as me, around say like mating preferences, biological sex differences, those kinds of things. Like in some corners of academia, those are offensive ideas. And I publicly said that. And somehow I got through grad school and nothing happened to me. But I have friends who like literally express the same opinions and have gotten fired or have lost their jobs or have had fellowships revoked and so forth. And so in a way, it's kind of brave in the sense that like, you work really hard to get into an institution like Harvard or Yale or Cambridge. And so to put that at risk of, you work so hard to get somewhere and now you're saying things that could potentially, undermine your career or wreck your reputation that you've constructed and worked so hard to attain. I think there is, like I just like there's probably a better word than courage or bravery, but there should be some kind of praise bestowed on someone who because like that's the only way we're going to get more people to speak out, right? Like in a way, like you
Mhm.
have to confer some status on taking those kinds of intellectual risks. Um, and so, but yeah, you're right. Like it's not the same. Like, putting out a tweet or writing a research paper is not the same as like literally getting to a fist fight or, putting yourself in like a physically dangerous situation, um, playing chicken on the railroad tracks or something, which is like, is that brave? I don't know. It's more just stupid, but like those are the kinds of things that my friends and I did when we grew up.
Yeah, there's this safety net idea, almost that with this privilege of going to an elite institution comes a responsibility to do something with it. Like you used this term in one of your articles that I really liked, although it was it wasn't casting the universities in a good light. This trickle down meritocracy idea that there's a bunch of affirmative action to get students from disadvantaged communities, almost like with the idea that once they're there and once they graduate and get a high paying job, that it's going to somehow benefit the communities. But in most cases, this person just now joins the elites and leaves whatever community they came from.
Yeah, I use that term trickle down meritocracy in the book. And other places I've called it trickle down diversity of, yeah, just this, to me, it's a very misguided idea of, a lot of these elite institutions use this term equity. And I used to wonder what that meant because we can't literally have equity of like equal outcomes across the board. But then I came to understand that like what they really meant was like within elite institutions, what you want is like either perfect demographic representation of the country overall, or you want sort of to make up for historic wrongs and actually have overrepresentation of historically marginalized groups in elite institutions. So, like, in other words, as long as like the top 1% of society is 50% women and X% LGBT and X% Hispanic and so on and so forth, that somehow we've achieved equity. And my question is, what difference does it make for the people who are actually in poor and marginalized and dispossessed communities if the president of Harvard or Yale is a woman of color or a member of this historically marginalized group or that? Um, like they don't care. They don't even know, right? Like they don't even know who those people are. Like that has no relevance to their own lives. And so, the logic seems to be akin to me to like trickle down economics of like somehow if we just let these benefits accrue to this 1%, then somehow magically the rest of the people will benefit. And the trickle down diversity or trickle down meritocracy idea of like, oh, if we just put enough diversity in that top 1%, then somehow those benefits will magically trickle down to other people. And there's just like that disconnect of like, okay, well, what is the mechanism to allow that to happen? Like, what's actually like, who is actually at the bottom of society who is benefiting from those kinds of policies? And to me, like the whole idea around equity or diversity or what have you is just, in a lot of cases, people just invoke that to advance their own professional interests of, in the name of equity, I want me or someone on my political coalition to occupy those seats, someone who agrees with me in order to advance a shared agenda rather than, actually looking at people at or near the bottom of society who are members of historically marginalized groups and figuring out how we can lift them up. I mean, it's so funny, like as the interest in whatever DIE or, the sort of quasi DIE, the precursors of that idea have, have achieved more and more prominence in elite spaces, inequality has actually increased in the US over time.
Hmm.
And the communities on whose behalf many of these people claim to speak, like they're not getting better. And in many cases, they're getting worse in terms of crime, in terms of addiction, in terms of incarceration, in terms of all these things. So, and then, like I almost, in some ways, I almost wonder if it's a blessing in disguise that they're just focused on navel gazing in their own elite institutions, because whenever they do turn their attention outward, not always, but often it turns into something stupid like, abolish the prisons or defund the police or like, and they think they're doing this in the name of actually helping these communities, and it's actually not helpful. So I don't know. It's I just have like a very suspicious and um, kind of you know negative. I just had like a very like unpleasant experience when I got to Yale and then at Cambridge and, spent some time at other elite universities too, like Stanford. And, just like the kind of prevailing dogma just seemed so either inwardly focused, but like using the language of helping the downtrodden. Or yeah, when the
Hmm.
attention turns outward, it takes on the form of luxury beliefs, which I know you and I have spoken on your podcast before, but there's just like such a disconnect between the elites and everyone else. I had this professor at Yale who I really liked, John Lewis Gaddis. He was a historian, and he liked this adage that common sense is like air. The higher you go, the thinner it gets. And I think there is something to that. That as you kind of lose contact with base reality and all of the friction in your life has been removed, and you know, like you kind of invent difficulties for yourself or, problems to solve, or you kind of forget the problems of those who are still struggling. And anyway, yeah, yeah. So that's something that I hope that my book will help to spotlight.
This is another difference about us that I've been curious about because when I first arrived at USC, like at my orientation, we had a small group, and the orientation leader was some undergrad who said, like, go around with your pronouns. And I don't think this was a thing at the university yet. Like, I think because this was 2018. So I think this undergrad was maybe one of the few people who learned about it in some humanities class and was kind of at the trailblazing end of it. And I just thought it was ridiculous. I never heard of something like that before. I'm like, clearly you can tell I'm male. Like I'm not going to state my pronouns. So I didn't get in any trouble, but I didn't play along. Although socially people kind of looked at me a bit funny. And I think the same things happened here at Harvard. Like I'm a diversity fellow here. So I've been on this committee for diversity and inclusion, and in grad school at USC during my master's program, I was as well. And I've always tried to champion this view of like diversity means diversity of perspective, even if that means more conservative perspective that you don't like. And I don't know when you were in school how much you conformed to the language or not, but at the very least, it seems like you took a keen interest in it and like, I'm going to observe these people and then communicate it to the masses. Whereas I've kind of went in just thinking, I never really bothered to learn. I still don't really think I know, but I haven't gotten in trouble for just being me and doing it my way.
Yeah. Well, that's good to hear. I mean, that's kind of a relief. I mean, maybe, well, the ooh, yeah, I mean, we weren't exactly contemporaries, but because there was like a bit of a difference in terms of like, I arrived
Mhm.
on campus in 2015. And that was kind of like, and then, by 2016, things really got crazy because of the presidential election and everything, the aftermath of that. But, that was like a very tense period, like the kind of the mid late 2000s. A lot of things were happening during that period. Like there were demonstrations at Harvard, Princeton. I think they like that Princeton, some students locked themselves in the president's office and demanded the Woodrow Wilson building name be changed. I don't know if they were successful. I think they were. That was the Evergreen thing with, Weinstein and his wife, and, like, just so like, a lot of this stuff was occurring, and so, yeah, I was just, kind of observing the campus culture during this kind of unique period. I think now things are kind of like the pendulum is shifting back a bit, and, like, I'm seeing sort of more people publicly call out the nonsense, but at that point, we hadn't gotten there. That was the line in 2015, 2016 was still, once these students graduate and get into the real world and into the workforce, they're going to realize like this crap doesn't fly. And, they're going to have to, realize that, once you're an adult and you're working, you can't do this stuff. And actually, as Andrew Sullivan famously said, we all live on campus now. And anyone who works at any elite or quasi elite institution, like they've kind of absorbed the dogma of social justice. And then like, in the wake of like the 2020, there's been a bit of a backlash in the pendulum swing. And so I think, yeah, there's a bit of a shift, but yeah, at that time I was just kind of I didn't actually have the thought I'm gonna communicate to this to the masses. It was more just like my own interest and curiosities of
Mhm.
like, wow, like this is like the most different place I've ever been. Like it's just so like there was a bit of a transition for me from Red Bluff to the military. Like it was a different environment. I did meet different kinds of people. Most of the people I met in the military were kind of, more from like middle or lower middle class backgrounds. I did meet the occasional kind of poor, some working class people too. Most of them weren't actually like me. Like they didn't grow up quite as poor as I did. So it was like a bit of a transition and adjustment. But Yale was just like, it's like, just a complete shift in terms of economic circumstances, family circumstances, sociocultural outlook, beliefs, habits, cultural capital. And, then later, like, once I started to write and communicate to the public, like, like that was what was on my mind. Um, so yeah, but it's good. I'm glad to hear that, like, you can do, you can promote diversity in the way that you think and the way that ostensibly, the reason why diversity is a value in the first place is not so that you have a bunch of people who look different but all think the same, but actually
Mhm.
so you can present different ideas and different topics. And even if even if within the context of an elite university, they're considered to be conservative, which is like, I mean, it's so funny, like because these universities lean so far politically left that even if you're just like a moderate liberal, you're categorized as a
Yeah, they
conservative just
think
because.
Pinker's a conservative.
Right, and it's like I've heard that from other like, I heard from a postdoc, at Cambridge a couple of years ago. He was like, "Oh, yeah, I like to" he's like, "I like to get my information from a variety of sources. I'll listen to right-wing psychologists, like Steven Pinker." And I'm on my I'm thinking like, if you go to, like, the average, like, normie American and, like, Steven Pinker just, like, explains his views and, like, where he works and what he does, he's like, this is like a liberal Democrat Harvard professor. Like,
Yeah.
he's like the archetypal, like no one would think like, "Oh, this is, some right winger." Like my mom would be like, "Yeah, he like." My mom was a working class Democrat, and she would hear like Pinker's views about like whatever, like everything, immigration and gay marriage and all the hot button issues. And be like, "Yeah, we agree 100% on basically everything," but within the context of Harvard, because if you're not 100% down with all of the identity politics, social justice stuff, even if you vote Democrat and you call yourself a liberal and you are a liberal, you're a conservative, which is really strange.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been actually leaning into that because ideologically I'm pretty aligned with Pinker, and I think that means more like classically liberal or maybe more moderate. But on this diversity committee in particular, I call myself conservative Christian. And I was raised Christian as well, but I'm not really religious in the way that most people would think of it, kind of more like in the symbolic way that Jordan Peterson talks about Christianity. But so, when you hear conservative Christian, what people might automatically assume is something like evangelical, MAGA, Republican. And I'm very far from that. But what I'm trying to advocate for is like, even if I was that, I should be welcome on this diversity committee, and that shouldn't be a problem because we should be accepting of diversity of all its forms. And for the most part, that message has been well received. Like, I don't know if there's any chatter behind my back about like, this isn't the type of person this role was meant for, but at least to my face, people are very open to that interpretation and think like, oh yeah, you're completely right. There aren't conservatives on this committee. That's something that we need to fix. We don't want to be hypocritical about the diversity committee not being diverse. So I think people have been welcome to it. And, I look at like the cancellation of Carol Hooven, who's
Hmm.
really careful with her words and really tolerant and kind, like in many ways, more careful with her words than I am. And we're both interested in hormones and sex differences. And she got in trouble, but I've never gotten in trouble. So I'm kind of curious why that is. It could be just the status difference, like maybe students are given more leeway, or maybe it's the pendulum has already swung back and things are safe. But my experience has been really positive. Like, I think it's misrepresented in the media a bit. The other thing is it could be just because you're interacting with people in person, face to face. I don't think people are as nasty. They give you more benefit of the doubt. And even though I have this podcast out there, it's still got a pretty small following. So it's not like you're going to be really targeted by a large audience.
Interesting. Yeah. So you're not attracting like social media mobs the way that like, because the way that I remember Carol Hooven's experience, it was like she went on Fox. She's pretty active on Twitter. She attracted people who are, held a vendetta and can rally the social media troops and can go after someone in that way. And, like now there's this, this phrase keeping receipts. So, if you put out some tweets, they'll just like, take those out of context or whatever, or like clip some things you've said and collect them and compile them. I mean, honestly, a lot of this just, you just have to like attract the attention of the right person who has like the right confluence of dark triad traits and for whatever reason doesn't like you. And, like, because I've had a similar experience. Like I've literally said the same thing as a friend of mine who was at Cambridge and he got fired. And didn't experience any repercussions. And so, it's hard. Like there's that, like, there's like a bit of noise. There's some noise here as far as like, people can have like the same experience, same information, same everything, but it just kind of depends on the circumstances around it, the people who are observing and the right moment. I mean, you're only in your second year. I don't want to jinx you or anything, but like, you know, you like next year there could be some like enterprising first year student who, you know, sees an opportunity, So it's like you never know with these things. And but like I don't, don't back down or anything. Like I didn't. Because I got lucky too in a way. Like in a way, it seems like we've almost had similar experiences where I was surprised when I got to Cambridge how welcoming and how fair people were to me. Like I wasn't the whatever, I wasn't leading the diversity groups or anything like that, but people were kind of aware of my views and I've written publicly and I was active on Twitter, all that stuff. And people were generally like, they just treated me as a curiosity. And it sounds like that's kind of what they do with you. It's like, oh, you're kind of like a different weird person, but okay, we can hang and whatever. And that was my experience. But, I know people who have had very different experiences. I know people who've gotten in trouble for less, for less than the things that I was saying, less offensive or less whatever, like provocative. So, it really is, in a way, I agree with you that it's not like there's this like rampant dogma in which every single person and every institution marches in lockstep and agrees 100%. And anytime someone deviates, that person is targeted. It's more so like, it's much more messy and noisy. And, I think a lot of people just aren't down with the kind of cancel culture, academic targeting. Um, and what really needs to happen for those things is like the right moment, the right fear needs to be inculcated into the people who would ordinarily dissent. And, you attract the wrong person at the wrong time who has a platform, who's active on social media, or who's plugged into the right networks. I mean, I know I've met people, like left-wing activists who are in like WhatsApp or like group chats with like 40 or 50 people. And they can essentially like have all like or most of those people show up at any like physical location within their city within like an hour's notice to like picket or protest. Or more likely what happens is they're just like at home and like all 40 of them can immediately like email an institution at the same time, or pick up the phone and start like calling someone's office or calling someone's boss, or organize some kind of like coordinated effort on social media. And,
Mm.
it's like it can be very beneficial to have like 50 highly motivated, driven people in a group chat who can collectively behave in that way. And if you catch wind, or if you catch the attention of one of the people in that chat who holds some kind of persuasive ability within those chats to get that machine moving, then you can, you know what I mean? And, fortunately,
Hmm.
it sounds like, I haven't had that, you haven't had that, but that happens. And it may, we probably know people who it's happened
Yeah.
to.
The other thing I've noticed on these diversity committees, it's like genuinely people are very empathetic and want to do the right thing. You can tell they tend to be really, really liberal. So sometimes that can be taken to the extreme of what you'd call a luxury belief. So, like thinking that the way to help is like defund the police or affirmative action or something like that. But for the most part, you can really tell they want to do good. And the other thing that's been hard for me to learn, although I'm trying to learn, is that the way of speaking in these committee meetings, it's like so affirming. So like everyone always begins before by like saying like, even if you're disagreeing, that's completely valid and I hear why you're saying that. And I don't really have a habit of saying that. I kind of just jump into whatever the point is. So it's sort of abrasive compared to some of the others, but also they're so understanding that they can tell like you're trying to communicate your own perspective and do what's good for you. So it's almost one of those things where even if I say something that would be offensive, not that I'm intending to, but like they can see that I'm not intending to and that I'm genuinely just trying to express my opinion with this idea that diversity of opinions is a good thing. So, I want to co- try and communicate that there's good people on both sides. This comes so politicized and like you get pushed into this sort of right-wing corner, which is kind of unfortunate because, like you said, we're both like classically liberal. Um, but I'm optimistic that the pendulum's swinging backwards.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like, yeah, it's not, I wouldn't paint these places with too broad a brush. They, like there are good people like most of the people within them are good. Like there is just like, weirdly, there is like a kind of systemic issue where people,
Hmm.
a numerical minority of people who, when the, circumstances are suitable and whatever, like they can find ways to, inculcate and advance an agenda. But most people within them, like even if they're kind of like broadly left of center, like they like having interesting conversations and they like to, they do believe in intellectual diversity and all those things. It's just, you know, people can weaponize guilt and people can do all kinds of things to kind of exploit people's kindnesses. And I think a lot of that is, kind of what happened. But generally speaking, yes, like and they're not monolithic either. Like, yes, there's a kind of systemic issue at elite universities, but there's plenty of good work being done within them. And there's a lot of great research and there's a lot of, there's a lot of interesting stuff being done. Yeah, in a way, it's too bad that like the political drama is what gets the attention when actually there's like really cool research and really cool scholarship and all this stuff being done. And, that stuff should get attention, as well. I mean, it's funny, like I'm kind of experiencing my own version of this where so my book a couple of days ago, my publisher called me and informed me that it was on uh it's a national bestseller. So it was on
Woo!
the USA Today bestseller list and Publishers Weekly. And like these are two like national bestseller lists. And somehow it
Congratulations.
was well, thanks, man. Thank you. but it was not on the New York Times bestseller list. And this was like so, like it's very rare to make 2 national bestseller lists and not also be on the New York Times list. And it's even my publisher is like, they think something fishy is going on here. Like they're actually inquiring as to how this happened. Um, and it's possible that because the list is not actually a bestseller list, it's like kind of books that sell pretty well, but also there's like curation and intervention, and tastemakers kind of give their own input on like how the list is organized. But then, like, someone from the New York Times the other day contacted me and asked if I wanted to write an op-ed. And so, not about this experience specifically, but more about like some of the themes in my book. And that, like the New York Times is like this elite institution, and within them, there are certain people who, have their agenda, but then there are other people who, also want a diversity of perspectives and opinions and so forth. And so it's like that, it's the person who reached out to me to write an op-ed is unaffiliated with the people who make the bestseller list. And like, these are two separate things, two separate entities. And, you know, it can happen that, even if certain people within an institution behave one way, others behave differently. And it's not like this kind of, they don't march in ideological lockstep 100% of the time and hold the same opinions and attitudes across the board. And I think it's like, it's easy to have that kind of, especially on the political right, that kind of outgroup homogeneity effect of like, they're all like this. They all behave the same way. They all believe the same things and act the same way. And it's not like that.
This seems like a win-win because either you'll get New York Times bestseller, or if it turns out that you should have been meeting their criteria because you've met other bestseller criteria, but you haven't, then that could turn into a whole big story that would maybe even generate more press than the New York
Yeah.
Times bestseller to begin with.
Maybe this is kind of a, it's like someone on the list actually, they are playing 4D chess or something, but I don't think that's what happened. I think, you know, more likely, more likely something else occurred there. So, but like I can't complain. It's like the book's doing well, and it still gets to have that little national bestseller thing on the cover, and you know, I can now officially request that people call me best-selling author.
Uh-huh.
Doctor, bestseller, something. I can
That's
all the
perfect.
accomplishments. So
Well earned. Thank you, Rob, for sharing. I encourage all our listeners to check out Troubled. And thanks again for your time, Rob.
did I send you that, or
You
did you
sent me
buy
the
it?
early copy. So this was
Okay.
my pre-order hardcover.
Oh,
And
thank
then
you.
the
Thanks for
early
pre-ordering.
reviewer copy I got was a paperback, and that has like that special stamp that says like, do not quote or distribute on final copy.
I sometimes do because I have a Twitter where I post things I'm reading, and I don't know if I'm allowed to, but sometimes I will pull out quotes and stuff from my galleys that authors will send me, and no one's ever gotten mad about it. I think like they have to do that legally, but like like realistically, they're just glad for any kind of promotion whatsoever. But anyway, thanks, Adam. This has been great, and let's do it again.
Yeah, look forward to seeing you next month in person.
Oh yeah, same.